Every single faction ever. Now, a lot has changed since the last time I played Radiation with my friends, one of them being the factions. So in this video, I'm going to catch you up to speed. I'm going to be saying the factions from least amount of troops to most amount of troops, as well as briefly going over what each faction contains.
Let's go!
There are a total of 22 factions, 9 of which are small factions. Up first, Blacktron. Blacktrons are a small faction that cost half a faction point. For that, you'll be getting 12 soldiers, mostly pretty lightly armed and lightly armored, but they do have radiation resistance and they also have a grid ship, which flies and can carry a lot of stuff. Up next, Police. 21 out of 22. The Police are a small faction with a small amount of soldiers, all pretty lightly armed, and a good amount of vehicles, more than most small factions, and I think some medium factions. Faction 20 out of 22. Robo Corp. A small faction with only 16 units and nothing else, but what they lack in numbers/equipment, they make up for in quality. Their troops are heavily armed with flamethrowers, explosives, etc., and heavily armored, with a few of their soldiers having reflex. They are a good faction to go for reflex soldiers. 19 out of 20. Spaceman. The Spacemen have 17 units, all of them light infantry, and with radiation resistance, in case the worst should ever happen. They also have 1 Mars rover and 1 small spaceship. Faction 18 out of 22, Aztec Empire. A small faction with 20 soldiers, all armed with spears, and a temple that's like a bomb shelter, where rituals to gods can be performed for more soldiers or gold. Faction 17 out of 22, Ancient Rome. A small faction with 21 soldiers, all armed with spears, shields, and the spirit of a lion. They are also armed with the best armor the Empire could make. Faction 16 out of 22, Knights. A small faction with 24 soldiers, armed with spears, shields, bows, and horses. They protect the land inside and outside of their walls. Faction 15 out of 22, Pirates. A medium faction with 24 crew members, as well as 3 small boats and 2 medium boats. When it comes to the ocean, this faction will be a huge pain for any enemies and a huge advantage to their allies. Faction 14 out of 22, National Russian Bioservice, or NRBS. The NRBS is a medium faction with 33 units, 1 transport ship, 9 small ships, and 7 speeders. Considering that everyone in the faction has some form of radiation resistance, this faction would be best suited for the wasteland and nuclear war. This faction, along with a few others, will be all that's left once everything has been destroyed. Faction 13 out of 22, Skeleton Faction. The Skeleton Faction is a small faction and has 32 units. The skeletons are very enduring and don't die from cold or other rough climates. Faction 12 out of 22, Native Americans. The Native American tribe is a medium faction that has 34 members, 8 horses, and 5 canoes, all of which is located at the main native village. Faction 11 out of 22, Ancient Egypt. A medium faction including 37 soldiers and 15 camels, with 2 of the soldiers being Anubis the god and the dead pharaoh himself. Faction 10 out of 22. The British are a medium faction costing 1 faction point, with 36 units, 4 cannons, and the Imperial flagship. This faction would probably be best to counter the pirates as well as other enemies at sea. Faction 9 out of 22. Aliens. The enemies of the Spaceman and the explorers of the galaxy. The Alien faction is a large faction costing 2 faction points. Within their arsenal is 10 spaceships and 37 units, including the Alien King and Queen. Buying the aliens will give you the biggest and best air force in the entire game compared to any other faction. Faction 8 out of 22. The Rebellion. The Rebellion faction is a small faction costing half a faction point. For this, you will get 40 units, not only including Princess Leia and Luke Skywalker, but others as well as 1 Tauntaun. The Rebellion Although it's a small faction, it comes with a lot more personnel than any other small faction for a very cheap price. Faction 7 out of 22. Islanders. The Islanders are a medium faction costing 1 faction point, with 52 units, 11 animals, 6 boats, 2 small boats, and the legendary Enchanted Island, as well as King Kahuka. The Islanders are a very stubborn faction, which will be great moving around the seas with their many boats. Once they've captured an island, their ability to dig in will make it impossible to get them out. This faction will be great for defense on islands in the ocean. Faction 6 out of 22. The U.S. Army. The U.S. Army is a medium faction costing 1 faction point, with 55 units, 6 basic vehicles, and 2 small vehicles. The U.S. Army is one of the few factions with plenty of medical personnel, as well as the most units of any medium faction. Faction 5 out of 22. Japanese Empire. The Imperial Japanese are a large faction costing 2 faction points, with 73 units, 3 anti-air guns, 4 ground vehicles, 5 air vehicles, the aircraft carrier Kaga, and all of this will be located at the final island before Japan, Okinawa Island. The Japanese faction is like the Islander faction, except they have an air force, and a good one, as well as a large army, who also have the ability to get dug in, making them difficult to remove from islands. Faction 4 out of 22. The Separatist. The Separatists are a large faction costing 2 faction points, with 90 units, 7 ground vehicles, the Invisible Hand, and Count Dooku shuttle, as well as General Grievous, Magna Guards, and Count Dooku himself. This faction has some of the best ground units, as well as a lot of tanks and a good amount of reflex units, and is probably best suited for land conquest. Faction 3 out of 22. Empire. The Empire is a large faction costing 2 faction points, with 99 units, among them Darth Vader and Palpatine, as well as Royal Guard units, 3 vehicles, and the Death Star. Faction 2 out of 22. Germany. Nazi Germany is a large faction costing 2 faction points, with 114 units, including a Volkssturm unit as well as Waffen-SS unit, 2 vehicles, like the Gustav railway gun, and a tank, and the Reichstag, which will give whoever has it dibs on Berlin. Other advantages of the German faction is the huge amount of troops they have, as well as the quality of those troops, and the single biggest and furthest reaching artillery piece in the entire game. Faction 1 out of 22. The biggest faction in the entire game, with the most soldiers and the most reflex soldiers, the Republic. The Republic is a large faction costing 2 faction points, with 127 soldiers, including Jedi like Shakti, Ayla, and Obi-Wan Kenobi, with soldiers like Captain Rex, Geonosis units, as well as other clones. This faction is the best for ground soldiers and reflex soldiers. Picking this faction will give you the biggest army immediately, as well as many Jedi. Well, that was every single faction in Radiation. I expect 2 specific people to watch this, and I want both of you to comment down below and let me know which faction I do a faction analysis on next.